Hi, everyone. Welcome to this October session of the Marxism and Disability Network. So today we are really lucky to have Felle with us, and Courtney will be presenting on young adults with rare conditions, the ODA generation, and I will now briefly introduce Courtney, and then I will pass over to them. So Courtney Felle, pronounced they them, is an MA PhD student at the Ohio State University, housed between writing, rhetoric, literacy, and interdisciplinary disability studies. Kearney is interested in diagnosis as a social construction and narrative tool, especially where it overlaps with concepts of crip time, trauma studies, and wider forms of oppression and catastrophe. Before starting at Ohio State, Kearney led a non-profit program for young adults with rare disabilities to find policy, advocacy, and public speaking opportunities. Their previous writing on disability can be found in Sick Magazine, Monstering Magazine, Interact, Advocates for Intersex Youth, Teen Vogue, and other publications. So it's really it's my deep pleasure to welcome Courtney. And sorry, maybe I forgot. So Courtney will speak, sorry if I'm repeating myself. So Courtney will speaking for about 30 minutes, and then we will have a 5 minutes break and then discussion afterwards. So thanks so much, Courtney. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for such a lovely introduction. Thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming. Kind of like Ariana was saying, a lot of my research interests are around that rhetoric piece. I'm really interested in how disabled people come to identify as disabled. What does that mean in someone's self-narrative? In what ways? What does it sometimes exclude? And then what do those self-narratives do in larger political and economic context? And so today I wanted to talk about this in regards to young adults with rare conditions. I know we referenced this, but that QR code will go to like an access transcript of what I'm going to talk through. There are a lot of like fairly dense details and examples. So especially if you're someone who likes to read or follow along, please feel free to access that. This presentation very much reflects like work in progress. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to like talk together about some of this and leave with different takeaways. I'm really interested in the landscape that surrounds how young adults with rare diseases come to identify, looking at some current key frameworks, and then looking at some of the gaps that currently exist. I would love any like thoughts, recommendations, questions. I also want to acknowledge up front, you can tell with my accent that I'm coming from the States. It's always fun to come from the States into like different international working groups because everyone actually knows how to pronounce my last name outside of the States and nobody in the States does. So a lot of this is informed by like very specific policy measures and legislation in the States. I'm very interested in also talking about that both internationally and transnationally. I'll mention that at a few points, and I would also love to talk about that during the discussion. Like I said, I'll try to build in some moments for like reflection or question. If you want to interrupt me at any point for like clarification with questions in the chat, if you like raise your hand or anything, please feel more than free to do so. So with all of that said, I want to get us started on our first slide, which is just like talking about what actually makes something a rare disease. I'm actually going to ask everyone to spend like a minute or two jotting down some ideas in whatever way is accessible to you. If that's just like sitting and reflecting on that internally, if that's using a piece of notebook paper, using like a tablet or your laptop. Nothing is wrong, just anything that comes to mind when I say rare disease, maybe the definition, examples, things that you associate with rare diseases. So I'm going to give it about a minute for everybody to just reflect on that question of what actually is a rare disease. Does anyone have any thoughts that they want to share out? Again, just general associations, impressions. Luke, I can see your like digital hand.
Hi, Courtney. Yeah, so I guess the first thing that springs to mind for me is it's a condition which is seen to require medical attention but can't be treated in the same way as things that hospitals or doctors deal with more regularly. And in my mind, that is possibly more important than incidence, because there are any number of variations of conditions that are treated in the same way as common conditions. We don't tend to call they rare diseases.
Yeah, absolutely. And so kind of what I'm hearing is almost twofold. First, that piece of like something being uncommon statistically also has those like social and policy implications where something is like under-researched or undertreated or under-known about to medical providers. And then also that piece where almost those perspectives are more important than like the technical statistical prevalence of something. And you're looking at things like variations, uncommon versions. I'm already starting to see that get a little blurry, and we're going to talk about a bunch of that. So that's great. Anyone else want to share some of the things that they were thinking about? Joe, I also see your like digital hand.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I know, unfortunately, the NHS definition of 1 in 2,000 people apparently is the hard cutoff, which is quite funny to get told kind of it's kind of like the explanation that if there's a less than 1 in 2,000 chance that the NHS pretty much won't really cover it. At least in my experience, anyway, that's kind of the thing. Like you have unfortunately lost the probability lottery. You won't get any help. That's been my experience anyway.
Yeah, and I think that definition tends to hold a lot, particularly across like European countries, and has also sort of moved outwards to some other countries that are looking at that as the model, where it's like roughly that 1 in 2,000 number you do tend to see a lot. And I also see you.
I would also say it's a disease that isn't profitable for drug companies to pursue and for research to be done on, so that it's undertreated and under-researched and underdiagnosed, because it falls into this. At least here in the States, people aren't making money from it.
Very much the case. And if we're thinking about it from that like economic perspective, it is very much the case that capitalism structures a lot of like what is or is not like profitable about researching rare diseases, developing treatments, and then working with patients, because it's essentially that question of supply and demand, where if you know that there's like a limited rare disease population, there's not that profit incentive to actually work on treatments for that group. That actually segues us very nicely into where I wanted to sort of situate all of us to start, which is what in the United States is called the Orphan Drug Act. The Orphan Drug Act, it's commonly shortened to the ODA, is the first law in the United States that codified what rare disease means. This was passed in 1983, and the explicit aim of the ODA in its legislative text was, quote, to reduce the cost of developing such drugs and to provide financial incentives to develop such drugs, end quote, for rare diseases. So from the onset, the primary concern in defining rare disease and the rare disease community was medical, on that need for curative therapies and treatments, and with that acknowledgement that medical developments were very economic and political for this particular group and in general. The initial legislative text was actually only qualitative. It defined rare disease as, quote, any disease or condition which occurs so infrequently in the United States that there is no reasonable expectation that the cost of developing and making available in the United States a drug for such disease or condition will be recovered from sales in the United States of such drug. So essentially very supply and demand, where they're looking at what is that expected population that would demand such treatment. And then, you know, if we made that available, would that be profitable? Also very much national in scope, not thinking about any sort of like international prevalence of rare disease, international audiences. That idea of like profit is entirely based very explicitly at multiple references in only that national market. So that's very much what you sort of see as like the original definition of rare disease. This still very much haunts like a lot of rare disease advocacy and activism, is that sense that rare disease is almost entirely about like orphan drug development. You'll still see like rare diseases often referred to as orphan diseases for some of that reason, which is essentially that they don't have like parent companies working on them or drug development in the works because of those like profitability issues. As you might expect from that definition, based even on some of the like ambiguities you all started getting into, that definition quickly led to a lot of health policy issues. There was inconsistent application from drug manufacturers who claimed to address rare diseases and thus earn tax incentives. You essentially get a tax break that has also since become transferable and sellable to other companies from developing something for like a rare disease population. So you can see sort of companies having that incentive to claim that they're making something for a rare disease, even if it was not particularly rare. Because the definition was qualitative, it really let people sort of try to make that argument and claim things. So there was a lot of trying to claim that certain drug development was for rare diseases when it was not. You also see insurance providers doing the opposite, instituting really strict definitions of rare disease so that they can avoid expensive reimbursements. A lot of rare disease treatments, because of the complexity of rare conditions, are very expensive. You see this with cell and gene therapies a lot in modern terms. And so anything insurance providers in the States can do to get out of paying for that, they do. So you have those like stratified definitions where at every stage it's kind of like, what is that particular entity economically incentivized to do or not do? And so then you end up with different things. As you sort of have all of that happening with that definition, you have in the States the private providers making really strict definitions, and then Medicaid and Medicare also kind of struggling to figure out what their definitions are. They could set their own definitions, their own like classifications. So even though a drug gets approved and in theory can be used for certain rare disease populations, it does not automatically mean it's covered by Medicaid or Medicare or by any private insurers. All of those are entirely separate processes. So in essence, a lot of those medications, even once approved, are still inaccessible to patients. This has continued even with the modifications to rare disease. It makes for a very messy policy landscape. So with all of that like initial chaos, only 1 year after the ODA's initial passage, the same original legislators amended the definition of rare disease to a more quantitative one. This is now in popular use in the United States specifically, and it's a condition which, quote, affects less than 200,000 persons in the United States. That's based on that 1984 amendment. This definition is blurry on its own. The amended legislative text still has a caveat that a condition would still be rare if it affects more than 200,000 people in the United States. But to sort of what Luke was saying, the company could still prove an inability to recoup the cost of developing and making available the medication via sales. Are there still social dimensions to which that condition is under research and under known? This vagueness has informed a lot of current debates over whether certain conditions are rare or not. Of course, those numbers also move. 1 in 2,000 is 1 in 2,000, no matter the size of your overall population. In the United States, 1 in sort of 200,000 people has changed. If it's less than 200,000 people in the population of 1983 versus the population of 2025, those are very different statistical numbers. In essence, the definition of rare disease is getting more rare because it's not being updated to demographic growth. So this sort of caveat maintains that initial difficulty of definition and enforcement. So you get sort of a lot of boundary cases. You continue to see this where it's clear that legislators are struggling with how specific to make the definition. The Rare Diseases Act of 2002 established the Office of Rare Diseases at the National Institutes of Health. And their definition was that rare diseases and disorders are those which affect small patient populations, typically populations smaller than 200,000 individuals in the United States. You can see that there's some slight differences. There's more emphasis on that number, less on the social status. But then they're still saying typically, and then they give some example rare diseases. And fascinatingly, many of them are not actually rare by that number that they sort of cite in their definition. They include Crohn's disease as an example of a rare disease in North America, including the US. That affects about 100 to 300 per 100,000 people. Rates are rising. I took that low number of 100 and 100,000 people and using the estimated population of the United States at that time in 2002, there were still 287,600 people who would have roughly had Crohn's at that time. So you're well over that 200,000 benchmark for an example that they themselves are using of a rare disease. So you really see a lot of blurriness in terms of how legislators are actually thinking about these things. And these definitional challenges continue to be compounded by various political incentives to preserve rare disease distinction. I talked about sort of on the research company front why that might be profitable. A lot of patient advocacy groups also want to position their condition that way so that they can appeal to drug manufacturers under the tax incentives of the ODA and get sort of special status protection with rare disease. So I have one of the conditions I'll talk about having today. I have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, HEDS. I find this to be a very useful example here. There are 13 subtypes of EDS. I am only talking about the hypermobile subtype today. I would like to be very clear about that. For HEDS, pharmaceutical companies and some of the patient advocacy nonprofits, particularly based in the United States, they originally approached HEDS as a rare disease. They assumed it was genetic. They assumed that it was statistically rare. Awareness started to spread and clinical diagnosis started to rise, especially among patient populations that had not had access to that medical information or to like actual like medical visits before. So it started to statistically move towards a more common condition. So you have improved knowledge, diagnostics. Those are goals of rare disease advocacy, but then they're leading to a condition potentially no longer being classifiable as rare and threatening some of that research ecosystem and all of the like tax and economic incentives that come with it. So the EDS Society, which is an organization I would love for someone to study, it is messy, there's so much there. They promoted the creation of a new diagnosis called hypermobility spectrum disorder, or HSD, which is basically a clinically observable version of hypermobility, whereas the sort of staggered HEDS diagnosis is still considered to be genetic. There is not yet a genetic marker that one can measure in testing. There are some candidates that have recently been identified in at least one publication that's come out in about the last year. So all of that is pretty rapidly changing. But in essence, you have that distinction between, okay, clinically observable, genetic, but we also can't really test for it. So how are we defining that difference? In large part, because of all of that like messiness in the ecosystem, it seems a lot like that goal is to keep HEDS as a rare diagnosis and then separate out a lot of other folks who are coming in with hypermobility into that HSD category. And this has practical consequences for the type of accommodations you can get in schools and in employment, for the types of treatments you're offered, for what the clinical standards of care are, and of course for just like your own like understanding, legibility to yourself, to other people, community. There's a lot of issues with that sort of staggering. And this has led to a reluctance on the part of a lot of medical providers to diagnose any sort of hypermobility because they don't really know what that diagnostic landscape looks like. This is especially true for a disproportionately female population. And then HEDS is very underdiagnosed in communities of color, particularly among Black patients in the United States. And so this is a contested frontier that really shows that blurriness of how statistical definitions do not keep up over time. I'm anticipating that such controversies are going to grow with that definition of rare disease. There's increasingly precision of genetic testing that allows for new rare diseases to be diagnosed. There are currently efforts underway in the states at some of the like larger cross-rare organizations to standardize a definition of rare disease in terms of how many there are. Those numbers range wildly. It's about 7,000 to 10,000 is the currently quoted number that you'll probably see most often. This depends a lot on how you classify single gene mutations. And then kind of talking a little bit about what we mentioned at the beginning, it also matters how you classify subtypes. Do you classify EDS as one thing or as the 13 different subtypes? Do you classify only the 12 that are certainly rare and then kind of like excerpt hypermobility, right? Like how are you balancing all of those things? Those are all very different numbers. One of my other disabilities, it's called cytochrome P450 oxidoreductase deficiency. You will not be quizzed. It's a very long name. POR deficiency for short, I'll call it. It was only discovered as a condition in 2005. It's quite a bit younger than I am, which is kind of funny. It is only diagnosable via whole genome sequencing. So that's inaccessible, unaffordable for most of the world's population, most people sort of internationally, particularly in the global south, and also many people who are facing structural poverty and medical neglect in the global north. This is like the vast majority of people who cannot access genetic sequencing in some way to be diagnosed with this condition. It's technically ultra rare, which is itself kind of a contested term, but no matter how you slice it, there's under 200 people worldwide diagnosed. It's a very, very small group of people. If you try to Google who has it, it's basically a bunch of medical articles and me. That is what you can find on the internet. It's of course likely that many more than 200 individuals have POR deficiency worldwide, but there's sort of that mix of a lack of access for those with severe symptoms, and then people with more mild or moderate symptoms may never think to access testing. Healthcare is very overloaded. It's difficult to sort of consistently access chronic illness management in formal healthcare for a variety of reasons. But because that new diagnosis is still sort of climbing in number, and because you sort of would anticipate that if you had better access to testing, you would have that grow quite a bit, you're also somewhat expecting to find new conditions, right? Like that is a very recently discovered condition. You are going to continue to have others. The number of documented rare diseases, I anticipate will also grow as new medical technology makes different types of disability possible. So as you have increased lifespans for certain disabled privileged populations, they might live long enough for new versions of that condition to become noticeable or quantifiable, or entirely new conditions to become noticeable and quantifiable. A good example I have of tech causing more disability is if you ever see those ads, I think they're international, about tardive dyskinesia and the prevalence of antidepressants sort of causing a new type of disability that then itself is sort of medicalized and treated. As you have more medical technologies where people are able to live longer and sort of survive certain symptoms, then you have new types of disability emerging. You see this a lot also with Duchenne muscular dystrophy right now, which is sort of expanding in terms of lifespan. Yay, medical tech is great for allowing people to live longer. But you have new manifestations of that disability emerging and new types of disability that people are sort of picking up later in life because they are now able to live to those stages. This is great, but it's also complicated because you'll anticipate seeing more rare diseases develop. I know that was a lot at once. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions that they would like to add in now? Okay. So the impetus for this presentation, and you can see in that title that I had given, it comes from a conversation that I had had with two wonderful rare disease advocates. Highly recommend their efforts. Annalise Williams and Amelia Hartley. They referred to young adults with rare diseases right now as this ODA generation. I thought that was fascinating, kind of off of some of what you might hear about the ADA generation. Their implication was that growing up in the decades after the ODA's sort of consolidation and legal definition of the rare disease community as a community, that young adults with rare diseases have come to integrate their own self-development and understanding of their conditions and themselves with that historically contingent identity framework of rare disease that's from the ODA and all of its sort of incentives and framings. This is really important when you also consider cross-rare disease advocacy beyond single diagnostic groups. The way that people beyond identifying solely with their diagnosis will also sort of adopt that language and advocacy of rare disease overall. There's also different patterns as to when communities or individuals strategically draw on cross-rare advocacy or not. There seems to be some sort of rhetorical usefulness in appealing to cross-rare collectivity in different moments. That might be, when you're looking towards economic incentives, when you're looking towards social belonging, and also that sense of wanting to feel less alone. And so kind of trying to expand that pool, my condition is rare, but rare disease overall is common. That's sort of that rhetorical trick that you see happening. That also has its own assumptions underlying it, its own economics. I'm very interested in alternate ways to think about that, beyond just what's strategically useful right now, but where we really want things ideally to move. It's not so much that people in cross-rare communities actually share the same biomarkers or symptoms or prognoses, but that there's some sort of collectivity about feeling neglected by the modern medical industrial complex. That in itself tends to be one of the very big unifying forces of cross-rare collectivity. It's built on that sense of my condition is under-researched, under-known, underfunded. That is the thing that unites a lot of people together. That's based very much on political and social forces that are very contingent based on the economy that you're in. That doesn't have to be that way. And so that sense of coalitional identification, I'm very interested in building off of in some way. So going into sort of where do we go from here? What are alternate possibilities? Unlike in disability advocacy, there hasn't quite been a second wave of rare disease advocacy since the ODA had passed in the United States. You have, of course, disability justice following disability rights, a more liberatory approach. You tend to have that a lot less with rare disease. That's largely remained absent. Definitions have pretty much stayed consistent from 1983 to the present. And because an appeal to current capitalist structures of drug development are so fundamentally interwoven with that legal ongoing definition of rare disease, I struggle to imagine what that more radical approach could look like, because it is so dependent on that current ecosystem. How do you decouple that? This is probably extremely obvious to say at this point in the presentation, but I think rare disease is very complicated, very messy, very interesting, and very under-discussed in a lot of disability spaces. I think it would benefit a lot of patients to have increased access to healthcare providers, prescribed supports from medication to medical equipment. But part of the difficulty with rare disease specifically is that you're always in the margins. People don't know that much about your specific conditions or needs, and you're always somewhat hovering where you're like piecing together access from what you can. So any change, even good changes, can be extremely precarious, and without a lot of like planning and detail orientation can lead a lot of people to lose access in some way to things that they need. So my example of this from the United States that I think is somewhat helpful to envision is the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA of 2022, allowed the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services to negotiate prescription drug costs for the first time. This is essentially a move towards that type of Medicare for all model, where you can have lower drug prices consistently for consumers in the United States. And even me calling them consumers and that being the healthcare term is like itself kind of dystopian. The intended purpose of the IRA, this provision, was to lower the cost of pharmaceutical medications and decrease financial strain and medical debt for patients. They focused initially on like 10 drugs across different conditions that were expensive but also necessary for patients to access to sort of be the pilot of this. But the legislative text of the IRA provides exemptions in which certain classes of drugs will not ever be considered for price negotiation, particularly classes of drugs which the regulators view as not likely to be economically profitable, with the added decrease in profit from potential price negotiation. So essentially, if the government is negotiating price, you might expect slightly lower profits with some sort of price cap. So these are ones that are getting exempted, essentially as an extension of some of that same logic from the Orphan Drug Act. But what flagged immediately for a lot of rare disease policymakers and advocates is that they exempted a category of medications that are approved for only one rare disease or condition and only one approved indication, which essentially means one symptom, one class of people, so like adults, pediatric patients, one select group of people. And what flagged here is that one of the incentives for doing rare disease research that is also typically encouraged is the idea of drug repurposing, the idea that if you find a medication that works for a specific rare disease, it often can also be used for other age segments of that condition's population, other sort of symptoms that affect that population down the line, or for similar conditions. You see this a lot with single gene mutations where like, yes, maybe you developed it for condition A, but it might also be really helpful for condition B, condition C. A lot of people take off-label medications for rare diseases or repurposed medications. And so to disincentivize that repurposing flags really big as like, oh, hold on a second. Like the way that this specific exception is written actually might do more harm than good in this particular way. This is really true for ultra rare conditions that can face that added difficulty in getting an effective treatment to market. So in essence, it discourages that research on medication repurposing. Repurposing is otherwise very time and cost effective. Obviously, compared to starting new drug development from scratch, all of the economics that go into that, it is very sort of effective to try to repurpose medications in a certain way. Insurance companies do not like covering things off-label, so successfully repurposing something and getting a new approval or indication can be really helpful for access, because then insurance companies have to at least cover it somewhat more. Again, the messiness of private insurance is a hellscape. But I use this particular example just to show sort of that those contours of rare disease, they require really significant attention to details beyond any sort of like well-meaning progressive intentions around sort of drug pricing negotiation. You have to be really in the weeds with folks who have rare diseases and have that policy expertise to really make sure that you don't have those unintended consequences for this pretty precarious marginal population. A lot of Marxist approaches to healthcare I somewhat think of similarly. Adler Bolton and Veer Kant have health communism. I think maybe a few folks were at that reading group that we did, which was lovely and very enjoyable. And they sort of speak broadly about some of these larger issues with the healthcare system, but they really don't get into the particular needs of like certain marginal healthcare communities, including the rare disease community. There's really a dearth of specific policy proposals in platforms that consider like home and community-based services, that consider research and development of new medications, not just access to existing ones. About 95% of rare diseases still don't have any approved treatment in the United States. So this is like a pretty large issue when it comes to still developing and sort of making available new medications. And then you don't even really have that basic awareness of like what distinguishes rare disease from common conditions outside of just statistics, those larger sort of social, political, economic, ethical questions. I am not necessarily convinced that like rare disease as some sort of label or community would cease to be relevant under a socialized healthcare system. There's still something about that level of like people being underaware and undereducated about a condition that sort of remains relevant, even if you restructure a lot of the economic ways that drug development happens, that medication approval happens, that healthcare access happens. But I also think it would be an extremely different concept under a socialized healthcare system where you're worrying less about some of this. I think it'd be really fruitful to develop different theories and policy proposals for how to incorporate rare disease in new different ways within a socialized healthcare system. I would love to talk about some of that together. I'm really interested in some of the alternate ownership models that have started to pop up. These are sort of different in terms of their economic and humanitarian incentives. There are small to mid-sized not-for-profit research and development firms, as well as companies that work really closely with nonprofit patient advocacy groups that have been doing some really interesting like alternate ownership model systems. There's a nonprofit advocacy organization in the States called the Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance, or FARA, F-A-R-A, and they represent those with FA, of course. And it was founded in 1998 by parents of a child who had FA. And their initial goal was just to raise funds for research and help coordinate some of that research. FA at the time did not have any medication in the pipeline for FDA approval. That can take up to 15 years. That was pretty ambitious just as a starting goal. So advocates and then some of the scientists that they worked with, they actually developed a natural history study to show how FA progresses without medication entirely on their own. They published that as the nonprofit organization. They funded research continuing from there on the source biomarkers of FA in patients, found some of those really critical biomarkers, and then worked with a lot of scientists and researchers to develop what ended up becoming the first FDA-approved medication for FA on Rare Disease Day 2023 in the States. That was really interesting because so much of that process was controlled by patients, both the institutional decisions, some of the scientific decisions. They had like very significant advising roles and a lot of collaboration with the actual researchers. And then they also had a lot of those economics. They had a lot of grants for researchers, so they had a lot of say over economically what was happening in that landscape, a lot of fundraising that ran through them. That is very difficult. That is also incredibly successful in this case and very interesting to see because the priorities of those studies and what they ended up getting out of them is astronomically different in terms of like how they understood quality of life, how they understood patient preferences, how they incorporated like actual patient-centered feedback than a lot of companies that do not organize in that way. So I really am interested in how that might provide guidance or example to other rare disease organizations and also to just large ecosystems of drug development, health policy, healthcare delivery system design. It's really an ongoing question for me of how we look at those grounded possibilities for alternate models, especially right now in the United States when the FDA itself and some of these approval pathways are under attack. Fascism in the US itself, also a hellscape. So kind of looking at like, what are the things we can specifically poke at and say, that is working, that could work better, we need to fund this better, we need to put attention on this as a real workable alternative. And that, of course, gets us back into some of that international and transnational landscape. I mostly focused on the United States. Most countries around the world and a lot of international NGOs, places like the World Health Organization, use that 1 in 2,000 number. It can really, really vary. Some countries have their own definitions as well. Some use multiple at once. It really, really depends. I'm very interested in how some of those definitions developed in different national and transnational contexts, why people chose certain ones. I think that's also helpful when you think about conditions that might be rare in the US but not in other places, and vice versa. Are you looking at something that's rare globally, that's rare in a particular location, that's rare in a particular country? All of those have different meanings. And so looking at that in a broader sense, I think would help a lot, both looking at global health inequities and then resisting sort of applying the US top-down model towards other countries. There's a lot of different interpretations of what rare disease can mean and does mean. And I think looking at that bottom up in a variety of settings would be extremely interesting and helpful. So there's still a lot of gaps here. I feel like I've probably mentioned a lot of things that have like pinged off everyone's brain on something you're working on. So even if you never sort of thought about rare disease as like a specific term before today, there's a lot of different gaps for like exploration, theorization, qualitative research with patients. And I'm just interested in how we complicate that very traditional understanding of rare disease that we have right now and look towards new models and then new sort of grounded examples of how we work from those models. So thank you for sort of listening to this presentation. I can lower my slides so we can have a discussion. I will note if you want a copy, I'm happy to share one. I have some citations here. I have some additional citations on some other slides, and I would love to talk more too. I'll drop my email in the chat before the end of this. But yeah, I'll stop sharing for now so we can just discuss everything here.
Thanks so much, Courtney. That was wonderful. Yeah, it was just amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah, so now we can have a 5 minutes break and then come back for a great discussion with Courtney.
Thank you so much for a really excellent presentation. And I have a lot to say. I'll try and be concise. I think we expect to see capitalism showing up in the medical system, but I think we also need to think about ways, especially in relation to this topic, that it shows up in the nonprofit sector and support groups. And I'm specifically thinking about two things. In the US during the early days of the AIDS crisis, when many people with hemophilia were being infected with HIV through the clotting factor, and people were turning to the Hemophilia Foundation for support, and the Hemophilia Foundation was being funded by the people who made the clotting factor. And it's certainly, the consequences were going to be terrible for the people with hemophilia, but they were made much worse by that profit motive being kind of subtly in there. And I have an ultra rare disease, and it's not the primary cause of my disability. I just lived long enough to start acquiring other disabilities. And I found that in the support groups that you find online, they really are very medically focused, and you don't have the kind of support. And obviously, I like medical advances, and I also realize that they can be tremendously complicated. And I was able to find out after getting a lot of medical damage from these medications that there's a dietary intervention I can do for my disease that does not get publicized, does not get talked about. And I don't know if people go on these support groups and post about it, if it gets taken down as a comment, but it definitely gets lost in the dialogue. So I think, some of the ways that this tends to get focused around orphan drugs tends to move us towards a purely medical model rather than a model of medicine combined with patient support and patient knowledge. So that's not really a question, it's a comment, but if you've got more to say about that, I'd love to hear it. Thank you.
I do actually have multiple notes on that. I think you're absolutely right too. In citing that example of the Hemophilia Foundation, this continues to be a problem where I would say the vast majority of what are called patient advocacy groups, which are those nonprofits in the United States, are funded by pharmaceutical companies. And usually, of course, it's pharmaceutical companies that have some investment in developing a treatment for that condition. But even the cross-rare ones are. I mean, the National Organization for Rare Disorders, NORD, some of the other like larger cross-rare nonprofits in the United States have that same issue where it is almost entirely pharmaceutical funding. And so then you really get a lot of blurriness in the incentives because the people representing patients are also in those more privileged groups who also have those very, very close pharmaceutical ties. In terms of calling things ultra rare, that's also a conversation right now that's happening of like where that distinction is. Is it useful to implement a decision on like what that definition actually is? Should it be quantitative? Should it be qualitative? How do we handle things like single gene mutations? I appreciate at least that that conversation has the awareness of should we do this? It's not just like what should the definition be? It's like, no guys, seriously, like should we have a definition? Like if it's unethical to do so, let's just not make one. Which is both interesting that people have realized that and also still very messy. It's also kind of been put on the back burner with the sheer chaos of the states right now. And then, yeah, that piece of like funding drugs and like how medicalized rare diseases is huge. And I think in large part, it's also because in the United States, other forms of support are still medicalized. So if you want to get something like a wheelchair, you have to go through insurance in a certain way or through Medicaid in a certain way. They call it durable medical equipment or DME, and you have to get like a prescription for DME, and it starts to become very medicalized as opposed to like, I need this to navigate the world around me. There's a lot of sort of medical gatekeeping of those services. Same with like getting access to any home or community-based care, even like parental caregiving to get any respite time or to get any money for that, which of course that can be like a very significant financial hurdle for many families. That all has to go through the medical system. So part of it is also that sense of like, looking really heavily towards like drugs and drug therapies is the only option. And then any of those other options are sort of grouped in almost secondarily to like, how can we make this as similarly medicalized as possible? And that is really hard to unravel. I also would love to see more like patient mutual aid networks and information sharing. This happens somewhat on social media. The actual material mutual aid can often be harder. I hope that was useful in giving some credit to the variety of ideas you had, because yeah, very much thinking, I think, along the same lines. Luke, I had seen you as well at one point.
Hey, hi, Courtney. So again, thank you so much for a really fascinating talk. And I too have a ton of questions, but I'm going to whittle it down to two. The first is on what appears to me to be a contradiction within the social identity of those associating themselves with a rare disease community. I don't say that pejoratively. There are contradictions in all of our social identities. But on one level, it appears that the associating oneself with a rare disease community shares some very important similarities with disablement, but it also shares a really important difference. So similarly to disablement, we're not talking about a material personal similarity between people, right? Like my rare eye condition and someone else's hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos do not need to feel the same. They don't need to, have similar functional effects. They don't need to affect our lives in the same way for us to say we are part of this shared community. In the same way that like a dock worker and a waitress don't need to experience the same things to both be workers, and someone with double leg amputation and somebody who has no hearing do not need to experience it the same way. So in that way, it's a very like clearly socially constructed category. On another, however, it still relies on the diagnosis in a way that disablement does not. And it also relies on a diagnostic process, which, as you have very clearly outlined, is even more obviously dependent upon state formation, market formation, so on and so forth, than might be said for disability in general, where often we're looking at things which very clearly are just your body different to everybody else's, right? And so there's less of a cover for quite how contingent it is. So it seems to me that you have a social identity which on one level is very highly predicated on characteristics of its of those who are within it, but on another level can't be fully grasped without recognizing that that predication is contingent and arbitrary. So my question is, how much awareness is there of that contradiction within the rare disease community? Is there kind of commentary on it? Do people play with the ironies of it in kind of jokes or culture? Is there a way in which organizing tries to take it into account? And my second question is actually on market formation for treatments, drugs, so on and so forth. I agree with you that a lot of the Marxist work on healthcare is deeply limited to distributional matters, for obvious reasons, right? When people were building really existing socialism, distribution was the main problem in developmentalism and healthcare. I'm particularly interested in the rate of profit, basically, just as a foreground of why I'm asking this stuff. So you note that in the American system, there are various tax subsidies for the development of treatment. So basically, the state subsidizes raising the rate of profit by the looks of things to the average for the sector. I would be really interested to hear who the main buyers of treatments are. Are we looking at primarily the state through Medicare and Medicaid? Are we looking at the state and a subset of insurers? Or will all insurers basically be the purchasers or the developers of the treatments in question? Because it strikes me that if we're looking at this as a kind of a situation where definition and intervention are purely mediated by profit and market functions, knowing whether and where we are dealing with full markets or quasi markets would probably be the first state to trying to categorize and strategize around the ways in which changes in the formation of capital and the capital labor relationship are likely to affect both outcomes and the strategic opportunities for organizing around this stuff. I've waffled on enough now, so I'll shut up, but thank you.
No, those were fascinating questions. Please do not apologize. I will try to split sort of your first question and then your second question. I tried to jot down notes to track them. In terms of the first one about like identity formation and some of those inherent contradictions, I think people have somewhat of a felt sense of that, but struggle to put it into words. Like there's certainly some awareness that these things don't totally coalesce. There's a lot of like strategic flipping back and forth between when people identify as disabled and draw on like particularly disability rights rhetoric around like access accommodations. And then when they talk about rare disease, I have tended to find in general in groups of folks that there is an emphasis that like rare disease shouldn't be only medical and that there are these social dimensions and that there are like bigger pieces of being perceived as disabled in the world and finding community. But then there's also this sense of like disability social model as like, because a lot of people, that's sort of what they've learned like disability movements to be. There's this sense that it doesn't incorporate enough like the physical reality of like, what if I can't get out of bed? A lot of the like chronic illness critiques of the social model, I really like see people sort of organically coming to about rare disease, where they're kind of like, I want things to be more medical, but also I hate the medical system. So it's not like I want it to be like this. There's a lot of attention to like, I need medical care, but I want the medical system to be different. There's a lot of like, can we educate doctors, which is like a very sort of reformist take on that. But I feel like that's how I see people like trying to navigate those tensions. It's definitely difficult. And I think that there's still a level to which people sort of revert back to like rare disease is under-discussed, underfunded. Like that's what unites us all together without then moving towards like, okay, but why structurally? And like structurally, why do certain conditions like need funding at all? Like how does this sort of larger system contextualize that? And that's part of why I thought the ODA Generation comment was so interesting, is it does look at that sort of contingency of like, you think about rare disease in this very specific, historically situated way. Because that is, I think, how a lot of the young adults that I have talked to have looked at things. And then in terms of the market piece, most people with rare diseases who would need very significantly expensive care are probably people who have like genetic or pediatric conditions that are then aging. So you are really looking at Medicaid as like a really prevalent buyer, a lot less at Medicare. The way to keep this straight, if you're outside the United States, the sort of heuristic that got me to remember this is we aid the poor, but we care for the old. That, you know, in terms of disability, that is like viewed as burdensome. That unfortunately is what helps me remember that. So Medicaid itself is going to be a pretty large buyer. And then private insurance is going to be a really large buyer. Any sort of employer sponsored plan, marketplace plan where people have private insurance, those individual entities, there's often a lot of pressure on them to cover these therapies. So those are really the two main classes of buyers you're looking at. Something to sort of add to this, not to make it more complicated, but I do think this is an interesting level, is that based on some of the sort of rewritings and amendments of the legislation over time, companies can either keep those tax breaks that they've earned from the government, or they could sell them to other companies. So sometimes what you have is small to medium-sized drug development companies selling tax breaks to larger companies because they need that money to stay afloat, or like a lot of the smaller to medium-sized firms really only research like 1 to 4 conditions. And if you've poured everything you have into trying to make a drug for Huntington's, by the time it goes to market, like that is an insanely expensive process. Like most of the time, those firms will have closed by then. So if you have that sort of small to medium-sized firm getting that tax break, often they're selling it to like Pfizer, Moderna, like they're selling it to Lilly, they're selling it to a very large entity for that then sort of payment. And that is very market driven. You can sell that for like whatever amount you negotiate, which is really fascinating. A lot of that is behind the scenes because it's really hard to follow the data of where all those like tax breaks and incentives go. Like those are often private sales. But that also makes it more complicated because if you're also thinking about sort of the company landscape, there's sort of this stratification of who ends up with most of those tax breaks and how. Are they getting them directly or are they sort of buying them indirectly? And they're simultaneously also buyers in this ecosystem that are then motivated by the continuance of those incentives, even if they're not themselves researching rare disease, because they're benefiting from them. So I just want that noted because that in itself is also really weird and not true in a lot of like tax incentive systems in the US, but it is true of rare disease. Did that answer both questions?
It did. So I just a very quick question of clarity. So there are instances which we can't track because we don't have access to the same information that others do, where firms start with the intention and sometimes even do research a treatment for a rare disease, do not bring a treatment to market, but make themselves profitable by selling the tax break that they negotiated to a larger company which is not engaging in the same level of research and production.
Almost entirely, yes. The one thing that I would clarify is you get that tax break by eventually having an approved treatment in some way.
Right.
So by the time you're at that stage of like being in sort of FDA review and approval. So maybe you've just
Right.
put like a treatment onto the market. Maybe it's not super accessible yet, but at that point, yes. Everything else in there in terms of that landscape and that sale, yes.
Cool, fantastic. Sorry, I'm just trying to link it up with analyses of fictitious capital from elsewhere in Marxism, and it fits a bit and doesn't. I'm going to shut up now. Cheers, Courtney. Appreciate it.
It gets abstract real fast. Ariana, I saw your hand.
Yes, thanks. Thanks so much for this wonderful presentation and the discussion now. So my question, so I was fascinated by many points you've explored, but one of these is how you, sorry, I'm looking at my notes. Yeah, how you are thinking, you provide some reflections on how it would be different. So the very concept and experience of a rare disease would be different under a socialist system, but also you look at examples in the here and now that are working away from a profit motive. So you explore these small non-profit realities and where patient advocacy is really at the forefront. So my question is how, so based on what you're seeing happening, but also in a more in a socialized, in a wider socialized framework. So you can choose the scale, but I'm interested in the contradictions that you've been really unpacking as far as especially the relationship between the medicalized framework that still attracts self-identification, but also social demands on the one end, and ways of and the urge to distance oneself from that framework. So my question would be how you see that a proper socialist healthcare would affect that contradiction. Would it? Yeah. So yes. That's my question. And also, as far as the small non-profit models that you discussed, Farah, and for example, if that, how you have already touched upon that, but I'm interested about whether these alternatives make things better, and how so. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think it's complicated, like in part because rare disease definitionally is so interwoven with profitability in the States and also unfortunately beyond. It's really weird to think about like what would continue and how. Like even to Anne's point earlier, like patient advocacy groups' priorities would entirely shift if they were not being like funded by pharmaceutical companies. You would have like just different amalgamations of patients forming in different ways that then of course have different priorities. And so I think a lot of that is in some ways open-ended, where it's like, how do people think of themselves? What will happen? I think that piece of sort of something being like underknown still sort of persists. Socialized medicine is not inherently personalized medicine. And so it's not inherently accessible to people who have conditions that might require a lot of separate research or a lot of separate like individualized treatment. And I just keep coming back to that idea of like details, like thinking very much about how something will impact like fringe cases, folks on the margins who have like more difficult or like weirder, less common manifestations of something. I have that very like disability justice, like center the margins kind of approach here. But I do think that helps in envisioning like what good medicine can look like in terms of like what just is truly accessible for like what people need. What is like quality for the type of questions that people have and the care that people need. That is somewhat of a short answer, and I think somewhat unsatisfying because so much of it is up in the air. But I think the fact that it is up in the air, or like that we can point to it and be like, there's more here to look at, I would love more people in the rare disease community to do.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was so helpful. So just a very short follow-up question. Yeah, I loved the centering the margins in disability justice point so much. And again, so in relation to that, so just because I love that so much, would you say that would be more possible within a socialist framework? Yeah.
I think very much so compared to like the profit incentives that you see like elsewhere. It's very hard to balance like even personalized medicine efforts that are underway. It's really hard to balance that with just the sheer economic cost of doing any sort of personalized medicine. Like getting whole genome sequencing is prohibitively expensive for most people to be able to do any sort of like personalized diagnosis with primarily rare conditions. And I think under a socialized system, you at least have those incentives changing significantly. And so that at least helps quite a bit with some of the like real main persistent issues that you see right now. I mean, particularly in the States, but really across areas.
Easy, thanks so much.
Joe, I also see your like weird virtual hand.
Hi, yeah. Hope you can see me. Thank you for the presentation. It's been great. I've just got maybe kind of stealing Ariana's idea a little bit here, but specifically about this like socialized medicine. And going back to the point that you made about being RE's health communism, and you kind of suggesting that they didn't really kind of flesh out a lot of what the ideas of what an actual communist healthcare system would look like. It was, I don't know, not very well substantiated maybe in parts. I think I really liked it, like that idea of it, but I felt like we were more kind of like dreaming rather than any kind of practicalities that we were talking about. So kind of just coming back to that and like what you say about socialized healthcare and that, you know, it should be better. I guess maybe from my thinking, basically like any kind of like just a entirely economically Marxist position, which doesn't completely rid itself of the ableism and disableism, which is kind of prevalent within, all Western society. There needs to be an effort for any movement to rid itself of that before it can, plant something truly liberatory when it comes to disability, or impairment, or anything in the future. And I guess my thinking is like, sorry, there's a couple of notes now. I was thinking specifically, so like the NHS, which is socialised healthcare, supposedly semi-socialised healthcare. It's a bit of a joke now that it is, but I'm thinking specifically as well, the fact that it is socialised and the fact that there's only kind of purely economic arguments that are made around it actually makes it quite. I feel like sometimes it's easier in the NHS compared to what I see from the US, to dismiss things that are rare and to dismiss things that might cost money to an already ailing NHS, which is underfunded and it's struggling to kind of try and do anything. It has to, prioritise those that matter most, the majority, blah, 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 whatever that kind of thing is. And I was thinking a lot with the assisted suicide bill, which has come, so it's in House of Lords now, but, it looks like it will go in. And from the organised left in the UK, there basically was very, very little opposition to that. I feel there's almost kind of like a tacit agreement amongst a lot of people that are like, well, the NHS is fucked, so maybe we do need to, save money from these things. And there's a real, you follow that argument down as like very, very far right, with that line of thinking. So I guess maybe to make this more of a question rather than a comment, like, what is, do you think, like a way forward into making this like to the study of rare disease, into it being a more liberatory framework and not something that's just going to have, I don't like the idea that there still is this hard cut off of what defines rare, and maybe under socialism we'll have more money to invest in the research of things and into medicine, but it'll go from 1 in 2,000 to 1 in 5,000, 1 in 10, 1 in 100,000. It doesn't matter if there's ideologically, if there's just one person in the world who has a disease, or even zero. Like, should we be abandoning this economic argument entirely and making it, maybe in my head, it's more about there's a gap in knowledge. We want to fill that gap in knowledge that's there. Like, should an argument be made more around that? I guess I'm interested in your opinion on that.
Yeah, no, I think so much of what you're saying is unfortunately very resonant. What I've seen people mostly rhetorically appeal to before is kind of that sense of like knowledge is also transferable. So something you learn for a condition that like only affects one person might end up sort of being really helpful towards other conditions, particularly like the mechanisms of research. I mean, they only found out that my condition existed because they were doing research in mice, and then we're like, wait, these mice didn't die, because up until that point, they actually thought that the type of genetic mutation I have would be incompatible with life, so that essentially there couldn't be a patient because the person would die in utero. Obviously, that's not true. I'm sitting here talking to you. So it's sort of in doing that basic foundational research on something else that they were like, wait, hold on a second, there's actually much more here. So that sort of appeal, I think it tends to work for scientists, but basic people like on the street don't really tend to think of science in those complex terms. So sometimes it can be really hard to get into the weeds of like defining that. I see this a lot with economic arguments in the States around like cell and gene therapies. They can be extraordinarily expensive because it takes a lot to develop them and a lot to like get them to patients. So even if you're just looking at like what is the cost of this development, it is often millions of dollars for like a single patient dose, which is prohibitively expensive for most people. Insurers love to try to deny this. That in itself is a whole mess. If you want to see some like exorbitant prices, just like look up cell and gene therapies, the few that are starting to be on the market. But I think about that even under socialized healthcare, because I think it's really hard to look at like a $3 million bill for like one treatment for a patient and be like, is that worth it? And typically the argument you see people making is the economics of like, well, here's what cost for the rest of their life would otherwise look like. And actually this is much larger than $3 million. So even though it's $3 million up front and that looks really intense, if you're really thinking in broader terms about like the other healthcare costs that they'll sort of incur, then that's worth it. And it's like, okay, but what about the cases where it's not worth it? And part of what that argument also leans on is this idea of like, if they have less symptoms, then they are missing less work. They're more productive at work. They don't need people to like take time off of work to help care for them. Like, you know, that missed time argument, which then gets you into some weird territory of like, what about people who, for whatever reason, might not want to pursue a particular cell or gene therapy? What about people who don't owe you productivity? What about people who have side effects, because we don't really know what those side effects look like 10 or 15 years down the line, that will still result in some sort of disability? Is that then failed, even though they did have a lot of potential successful outcome of that treatment? How they assess success might be different than how you from the outside are assessing success. And that is really a moving frontier where I really am mostly looking to cell and gene therapies, because so much of that is happening in real time. And this is also weird with like a lot of the larger cross-rare organizations in the States. Some of them did do economic studies on essentially trying to show that like upfront diagnosing rare disease in a timelier way and then getting people treatment sooner is cost effective for insurers and for those patients. But like, what does it say? And part of why they did that, which strategically I understand, is that they kept coming in with the humanitarian argument. Legislators were like, show us numbers. People don't care about this. And so like their reasoning for doing this is like, this will get people the resources they need. And unfortunately, they weren't wrong. But it's weird to be like, sort of have to point at numbers and be like, this is cost saving. And it's like, okay, but like, diagnose my kid. Like there's a lot of other reasons that is like helpful. And so I think that's something that I'm kind of trying to figure out is like, how do you make those other arguments in a way that people don't automatically dismiss as trite or as like under-researched? Because the comment you always get is like, well, this needs more research. This needs more research before we can make a policy change. Get funding to do the research and then we'll do it. And it's like constantly pushing that timeline. So how do you get people to understand, no, it's not that this is under-researched. Like this is sort of the theorization of what all of this means. And also with the assisted suicide bill, MAID scares the shit out of me from the States. Scares the shit out of me as a policy area. So I don't disagree with you about also kind of watching how economic sort of arguments there are happening and heavily influencing arguments about healthcare in other places.
Thanks for the answer. I think I agree that there's like it's like a lack of imagination, almost to say it, like the horizons of what to even discuss about a potential future. Everyone is so mired in that economic rationale that they don't even see that they are mired in it as well. All of the 90% of the discussion is economic, even we're not just talking about capitalist dollars. It's still about trading off whether it's worth spending the resources on something, and that's not very liberatory. So thank you.
And you still get that in so many conceptions of socialized medicine, where it's like, do we pay for this? And it's like, well, that in itself is a whole ethical question of why you're still doing that. Yeah, lots of stuff about quality of life bills too, and like the ways that like definitions of quality of life are economic. Decoupling quality of life, like that actual metric, from economics, like sort of just losing that as a metric entirely, would help this discussion a lot. Jonathan, I see your virtual hand too.
Hi. I just like something. So I'm in Canada, so we already have MAID, and just what kind of Joe was talking about. I'll just echo that. First, there's a lot of negative pressure here around funding treatments for anything that's not like scalable. So that's definitely a reality, and also very quickly within a couple years. The medical assistance in dying quickly expanded to people, who were experiencing depression and things like that. And they're like, have you considered, offing yourself? It very quickly became what the disability advocates were talking about. And it was a similar state of affairs, Joe, to what you had said around like crickets from the left in terms of advocating for any kind of sensible limitations on its expansion. They did finally stop its expanding, but it's been quite the journey for folks. And just speaking under an ostensibly socialized medicine context in Canada, and also in proximity to the states that we are, there's an interesting thing where people can be refused care for rare treatments, but then if they have the means or the private insurance, they can go to the States and shop for treatment there because it is a privatized system there. So a really weird kind of I don't know what you call it, like a wake or a ripple from living close to the States. so just to like some of the things we're talking about, just to add some context, and then I'm just thinking a lot about this health communism, and also I know not everyone was here, but for Keith's presentation last month around looking at different like kind of ontologies or ways of conceiving things, and I'm wondering like this idea where we kind of constantly individuate things, and so like in capitalism, like amongst people, we kind of like prioritize the individual and their individual profit. But then even in healthcare, and maybe this court is where I'm trying to connect back to what you were talking about, where we increasingly become more discrete in our analysis of each manifestation of a symptom, to the point where you were talking about where you have, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of your diagnosis, but where you have like 13 kind of like variations of that diagnosis. And I'm wondering if like part of like health communism is looking at the whole, like, and that kind of brings me back to Keith's talk about different ontologies, like Chinese medicine and indigenous ways of looking at health and healing, where we're not like, I mean, there's always going to be instances where we need to like be looking at individual manifestations, but also like looking holistically at a person's health, which also relates to MAID. Anyways, just thoughts about that. And then one clarification, I was wondering, isn't there a lot of state subsidy for the development of drugs in the US as well, like in terms of funding to universities and things like that? So is that another stream of profit for pharmaceutical companies? I'm wondering, as well as the tax credits you were talking about.
Mostly no. In theory,
Okay.
so mostly a lot of the small to mid-sized rare disease, like drug development companies in particular, work independently of universities. A lot of times universities will work on like existing sort of like medications or like regimens. But typically the university ones are for some of the like larger rare diseases, quote unquote, that already have some like treatments developed, or some like clinical standards. Most of the time, the like smaller to mid-sized companies that are working on things are either like funded with seed money or some sort of venture capital, which itself, yikes, lots of private equity in this space, or you have some sense of like private fundraising, which is also where you kind of see the development of very, very tight relationships with patient advocacy groups, who might be doing fundraising in some way for some of that research. It really depends on the condition and how like well known it is, even outside of its statistics. But in general, there's not too much state subsidization or like university grants where it would be like indirect state subsidies going to those. Particularly, I'm looking mostly at small to mid-sized. I recognize that we're going a little over time and I want to be respectful to everyone. So I'm going to put my email in the chat too. So if anybody wants to follow up and talk more, I would always love to talk more about this. And I'm sure I'll see most of you at future Marxism and Disability Network events too, and future reading groups. So that also makes it easy.
Oh, that's so nice, Courtney. Thank you so much. So, yeah, so Courtney's email is in the chat. Hope you can see it. And if you're watching in the recording and would like Courtney's email, just email us, or probably you can find Courtney on the list. But if not, just drop us an email and we'll share Courtney's email address. Yeah, so Courtney, again, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and a wonderful discussion, which I'm sure everyone has enjoyed greatly. I have, so thank you so much. And look forward to meeting you all and yourself, Courtney, in future sessions. Thank you so much. Hope you have a really nice rest of the day, Courtney, and everyone else. If you're in the UK, good night. So
Thank you all too. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.